As you can see, I have officially shaved a chunk out of my hair, and it feels great. It's fantastic. Hey guys! So in today's video, I'm doing what I'm considering a color palette challenge, in which I'm working on 3 separate Photoshop pieces, but the catch is I'm only allowed to use the colors in the palette on the screen. So I hope you all enjoy, and I will see you there. So something that I have recently realized and mentioned in a previous video is that a lot of my artwork tends to be very similar in terms of color. And as with all elements of your art, sometimes the best way to get better is simply noticing that you're lacking in something and then taking steps to improve that thing. So over on my Instagram, I decided to bring back something that used to be very popular / trendy on Tumblr, and this was a few years back. And it's a color challenge where you create color palettes and have people send you prompts and then only use the colors in that palette. And originally, I believe this was with pre-existing characters, but I had people give me prompts that were a little more open-ended, and I could come up with my own concepts. Something that was definitely very different for me is that I didn't blend anything, and I also didn't add black for outlines. So I used the darkest color to create my line art, and then really focused on shadows, specifically the shapes of them, to create more dramatic lighting effects. And I find that this is also something that I struggle with, so I was able to kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone with this color challenge, because I was able to stretch myself in ways that I typically avoid. Something I did realize is that the more I worked with exclusively the colors in the palettes, the better I got at it. And this is a fairly understandable concept, because as with anything, the more you work, the better you'll get. That's where the whole practice makes perfect idea comes from. Personally, I'm not so sure about the perfect part. I tend to prefer the phrase practice makes better, because in my personal opinion, my artwork will never be perfect. But taking small steps so that each piece is better than the last is part of that continuous improving and becoming better. And this translated to working with the colors in these Photoshop pieces. And I actually did another piece in addition to the ones I recorded, and that very last one is actually my favorite out of all of them. Something else that these palette challenges force you to do is be a little bit more creative with how you actually use those colors. Because sometimes when you have all of the colors in the world available to you, you can become a little overwhelmed and sometimes overwork the colors. And you are naturally going to be less creative because you're going to pick what feels the most defaultly correct, quote unquote. At least that's what I find I do. And that's how I fell into this rut of not using colors to the full extent of what they are capable of. And an example of this is the very first piece that I did. I created a vine-like effect on the character's skin. And this could be interpreted as a tattoo or a scar or anything magical. But I probably never would have thought to do that had I not been looking for a way to make the piece look more visually appealing. Now, speaking of this first piece, the prompt that I was given was simply boy. And that in and of itself was a challenge for me. I'm sure that the person that gave me the prompt knew that I didn't draw guys very often. And so I appreciated that because it gave me the opportunity to push outside of my comfort zone. And this man is not necessarily very masculine in the traditional sense of the word, but it is a guy. And I decided to focus on the profile specifically because I could create a more structured face shape and create more interest in that way. And as you can see, as I work on this piece, I was still being pretty timid with the usage of color. However, when we move on to the second piece, the prompt I was given was Tree Girl, and the palette really didn't have a lot of tree-like colors. There wasn't a single green in the entire palette. And that's part of the fun of this challenge to me, is finding ways to interpret the colors in a non-traditional way. And I knew that I really wanted to push the lighting in this piece to create something very different than the light sources that I typically use. And so I decided to do something that was representative of light filtering through trees at an angle. And in the end, I think it really turned out interesting. It's one of the more experimental pieces, and there are definitely things that I would change. For example, I'm not exactly thrilled with the hair. I was trying to make it feel kind of messy and full, but something about the shape of it is slightly off and feels very unnatural. But I do really like the way I used shadows with the skin specifically, because I never would have thought to use blue that starkly different for that amount of shadow. But I really like the way it looks. I think it's very visually interesting. And it's something that I would be willing to experiment more with in the future, just because I've seen what I'm able to accomplish when I'm using more atypical colors for shadows and things like that. A final note about this piece is I also feel like the background could use some work. I added a lot of tree-like shapes in the background and slightly in the foreground, but there's something about it that feels very barren and not what I was aiming for. But I had tried to use some of the colors as more of a background color as opposed to keeping it white, and none of them really worked. So as far as the background was concerned, that really was a not so good thing about the color palette. And I think this is where, when it's not a challenge and it's more a self-given guideline, you could push outside of that color palette just to finish it off. Now, for the third and final piece that I'm doing in this video, the prompt was half animal, and this is definitely something I'm not familiar with. I don't do it very often. I'm not particularly interested in pursuing that as an overall element of my style, but I did find it a lot of fun to do as a sort of one-off piece. Something I am particularly happy about with this piece is the color that I chose to use for the skin. And this is another area where having a limited color palette helped. Because if I were to color this without the guidelines of the color palette, I probably would have chosen a fairly natural skin color to contrast with the more feline-like elements of the character design. But because I didn't have that option, I was forced to use a gray or a pink. And I was thinking about going for the pink because there are some skin tones that can look a little more pinkish, but I decided to just really take the leap and use gray, and I think it looks really, really cool. And I would like to do more drawings in the future of humanoid figures with gray skin, because I do think it's such an interesting look that it can almost look natural in some contexts. Now with this piece, as with the last one, I was really trying to push the light source. And I don't do a lot of light sources that are coming from the bottom of the figure. And this light source specifically was supposed to be coming from the left-hand side, pointing up at an angle. And I knew that I wanted to try again with a more untraditional light source, and I'm really happy that I did, because the way that the shadows fall in this piece seem to be the best out of all three pieces. I tried to be very intentional about where I was placing the shadows, and this is another thing that I realized as I moved through this challenge, because with the first couple of pieces, I was slowly becoming more comfortable with the idea of shadowy shapes, whereas in the very first one, you can see that I was still being very timid and not blocking in large amounts of shadow. A final little thing that I really like about this piece is I gave her a little scar on her face, and it was supposed to kind of look like whiskers to a certain extent. There's only one on one side of her face, and I just think it's a nice little detail that I personally had a lot of fun with. So in the end, I really enjoyed working on this challenge, and it was challenging. But it's something that I can see myself learning a lot from. I definitely would be interested in doing these types of color palette challenges in the future. Maybe more self-organized, where I choose a random color palette and then force myself to draw off of it. And then maybe do what I had said earlier about allowing myself the freedom to add a couple of additional colors if I need to fully finish the piece, but for the most part sticking to the colors in the palette. So I hope I inspired some of you to create something today. If you are interested in trying this challenge, maybe just try a random color palette generator and work from that. I'd be interested to hear from you if you decide to give it a try. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.